a forge out there. Of course, he'd been a blacksmith quite a bit of his life, and I would want new bought toys like I'd seen other kids have. And my father would never do that. He would always say, "Here's the shop, the forge, and all the tools. If you want a toy, you can make it." At the time, I thought that was quite hard-hearted of my old daddy. But when I look back at it now, I can see the wisdom. I can see what he taught me then. He taught me that if you need something, you don't have to go to a store to get it. You can build it. I hope I'd pass that same knowledge on to my own sons, but evidently I wasn't quite that rough with them. During the summer of 1922, my grandfather's new brother-in-law, Edgar Macklin, he came out from Ohio to visit Grandpa, and he came out and spent a few days out there on the farm, Grandpa and Delia and Edgar, and we'd hitched up a horse to a little old spring wagon, and we put a barrel of water on there, and this was great sport in the summertime. We'd go out there and see some striped gophers, and we'd run them down the hole and then come along with the water and pour some water down the hole and drown them out and catch them. And this Edgar Macklin just had a terrific time out there on the farm watching us drown out them gophers. And he would laugh, and just, we really had a good time. And we got some pictures of taken with Blanche's camera while we're out there drowning out these gophers. Grandma Madison came out to visit us during that summer, and we took some pictures and some clowning around, which also are among our souvenirs in that box of pictures. And my Uncle Gale, that's my mother's brother, he'd come out to visit. And I remember one of the things that he talked about until his dying day. I had got a little mouth organ, one of those little short ones that's only about 3 inches long, or 2.5 or 3 inches long. And I had got to be quite a mouth organ player, and I developed a trick of sticking that mouth organ into my mouth, and then I'd just be tongue it to play it. And I could turn out some pretty good tunes, and Uncle Gale just thought that was something. He'd see me and he'd hear that music coming, and yet no instrument in sight, and he never tired of telling people about that. It was during this time, during the winter, I don't know what year that was, whether it was 22 or 23, but sometime along in there, I had gone to an auction sale, and I picked up a nickname there that stuck with me all my life. The kids at the sale had got to playing around in the barn and kicking the hay down through the hay mow and throwing straw and whatnot, and a kid there was considerably bigger than me. He was a red-headed boy, and his name was Brosamley. He'd throwed some straw on me. Well, I thought it was no more than fair if I throw a little down his neck, so I'd got him underneath the hay mow hole and dropped some straw down on him, went down his neck, and made him a little bit unhappy. And he called me some names that my father wouldn't stand for. As anytime he heard somebody call one of us boys that name that indicated that your mother was a dog, my dad just wouldn't stand by and watch and let one of us boys be called that by anybody. If we didn't do something about it, then he'd paddle our butt. Well, this kid called me that name, and of course he was bigger than me, and I didn't want to do anything about that until a hand grabbed me by the back of the neck and turned me around, and he took a look at me. Well, I know what I got to do then. Either I got to whip that guy or my dad's going to whip me, one way or the other. So I called the boy on it. We go outside of the the barn, and of course he's bigger than me, so I know that I'd have some clinch with him, so I had to depend on a little footwork, and so I clipped him in the kisser when he made a rush at me, and I'd sidestep him and smack him, and of course they hollering fight, fight, and so they made a big ring of the men there, and we stopped the auction sale, and we were going at it pretty good, and I discovered that, hey, this ain't bad. I must be pretty good at this, because pretty soon I had that big red-headed boy, his nose was bleeding, and then his father stepped in and was going to stop the fight. Of course, my father went and told him that the fight was going to continue until this boy decided that I wasn't what he'd called me. So after a while, this boy that was a good head taller than me, he was down on his knees, and of course he was bawling, and I'd ask him a couple of times, to tell me that I wasn't what he'd called me. Well, he finally decided that that's the way it was, and that stopped the fight, but I did pick up a name there. Everybody at that auction sale started calling me Cocky, and I bore that name until several years later, when I moved away from Browns Valley to get rid of the name so my boys wouldn't have to put up with it. It was about this time that I had a baby sister named Donna Fay. She was born, and she died the same day as her birth, but again, it was quite a shocking thing to me. She's buried at the Battle Center Cemetery out there about 2 miles from the old farm out there in near Cushing. It was about this time when I was going to school that I saw a basketball game for the first time, and I watched the guys dribble that ball, and I was quite fascinated with that. So after a while, I had got hold of a basketball, and the hay was all out of the hay mow in the horse barn, so I'd take that ball up there in that wooden floor, and I learned to dribble, and I finally had blindfolded myself and hung strings so I know when I'd get to the end of the barn, so I could dribble that ball blindfolded behind me and around me and every side. I got quite good at that. We lived there on that farm until 1924 in March, when Dad had gone up to Minnesota, up closer to where he had 3 other brothers living up there. His twin brother Raleigh, and his brother Bob, and his brother Will all lived up in that part of Minnesota, so rent was cheaper up there. So Dad had rented a farm up there, and we had a sale. My Uncle Raleigh came down and picked up the boys before the sale, and he took my dad. By that time had an old Model T car, and Uncle Raleigh drove the car back to Minnesota, and he took the 3 boys with him. And I remember the day because my Uncle Raleigh gave me a dime. He said that was a penny for each day of my birth, and that was my birthday, the day that we drove up to Minnesota with the old Model T. There I went to country school for the first time. And an interesting thing there, Dad had bought some horses, and among the horses he bought was an old sorrel mare. And he decided that was a horse that we'd drive to school. So he went to put shoes on her. She was just an old workhorse, didn't seem to have too much zip. But when he went to put the shoes on her, that horse went plumb crazy. And he had her tied to a wheel of a triple box wagon out in the yard. That wagon was full of shelled corn, and that horse got her front feet up in that wagon, and finally he pulled her off there and got her over on her back and tied her feet together and got her shoes on. That horse screamed. That's the first time I ever heard a horse really complain like that, to really scream. It's quite a frightening thing to hear if you ever heard it. It upset my mother quite a bit, but my dad, his pipe stem would raise up and his old pipe bowl would come up off of his chin, and when that happened, that whatever he'd set out to do was going to get done. But he got the shoes on her, and then in the summer of 1924, they had a flu epidemic, and again, my father. Oh, I'm wrong about that. It was the summer of 1925, because Margie was born already, and she was born in October of 1924, and it was the next spring that Dad got this flu, and all the neighbors around her had it too. There weren't the deaths that there was in the 1918 epidemic, but there was a lot of sick people. And my Uncle Bill had came up to help take care of my dad. We never expected him to live. He was delirious for weeks at a time. And of course, Elmer was sick. He was the older son. And it kind of fell on me to get the chores done and to put in the crop that year. Well, I had watched Dad plant corn and all these things, but I'd never done it by myself until the spring of 1925 when I planted the crop, planted corn with the horses, made a big error, got the horses on the wrong side of the check row wire, and I had to get down to the end of the field before I discovered that mistake. Well, then you got a problem. I had to take the wire loose and drag it back, get the horse and the planter turned around and around on the other side of the wire and get it stretched up again. But I did manage to get the crop planted, and it turned out to be a pretty good crop. But in the meantime, all of Dad's brothers had came, not expecting him to live, but they all cut fence posts. We had to make some fence, and all the brothers were in a wagon. We had a single box wagon and a team of horses, and we went out, and they all had axes, and they all cut posts out of the woods out there. And remember one day, all the brothers was in this wagon. We were going to start out, and Squint was driving the team, and I don't know, somehow or other, he dropped one of the lines, and the horses run off. And scattered uncles jumping out of the wagon, and the team went down through the field. We just had quite an exciting day. In the meantime, I was helping some of the neighbors do their chores too. And one of them was Johnny Gleese, and he had some little boys that hadn't started school yet. And quite a funny thing happened with one of them little boys. A cow had a newborn calf, so I'd put the calf in the feedway and between the two rows of cows, and I was getting the rest of the chores done, and one of the boys was little Peter. He was sitting there playing with that little calf, and the calf, of course, passed some of that taffy that newborn calves do, and it had fallen down and gotten on Pete's clothes, and Petey grabbed a handful of that, and he said to that calf, "Crap in your own face, will you?" And he grabbed it in his hand and smeared it all over that calf's face. He wasn't really dirty until that happened. My sister Ethel Jean was born sometime in 1925, and she was a blue baby. She lived about 11 days, and then she died. Another sad experience, learning about life and death. One of the neighbors, Leo McCann was his name, he had bought a farm and bought a bunch of cattle and equipment, and got married and started himself a family, and In 1926, that's the year that Ethel Jean was born, he he could make a payment, but he was just about broke, and he came over to tell my dad. He said, "I don't know what I'm going to do." He said, "I can make the payment on the livestock, I can make a payment on the farm, but if I do, I'll have to kind of sell the cattle and whatnot, and then I don't know how to make a living." So Dad, in the meantime, had a granary full of flax, and flax was quite cheap that year. So Dad had told Leo McCann, "Well, sell all the livestock and everything except the horses and enough machinery to plow up that whole farm, pasture and everything, and seeded all the flax, and I'll furnish you the seed, and you give me back bushel for bushel in the fall." So Leo McCann did that, and I remember to this day yet in the fall when he came over and he'd thrice his crop of flax. He got a terrific crop, and the price was high. The price on flax was $7 a bushel, and he'd harvested enough flax to pay off the whole farm, pay off all his debts, and had enough money to restock his farm if he wanted to. Thereafter, he wouldn't do anything in the line of crops until he come over and consulted with my dad. But my little sister, Ethel Jean, was a blue baby. She lived about 10 days. That was late in the fall of 1926, and she kept getting weaker and weaker, and I was sitting there holding her, and she died in my arms, and she's buried in the cemetery just outside of Lismore, Minnesota. Later on, I guess it was the following year, I had stayed home from school one day, and because I wasn't feeling good, I had a sore throat and whatnot, and this was in the spring, and Margie must have been about 4 then, because she was 2 years old when Ethel Jean was born, and Mother was washing clothes, and she said as long as I was home from school that I should keep an eye on Marjorie for her. So I was reading a book, and I'd got absorbed in the book I was reading, kind of forgot about Marjorie for a little while until I looked up and I didn't see Marjorie. So I run outside to see where she'd gone to, and we had a cistern out there alongside the house. That's what you use to wash clothes and everything, with soft water. And the cover was off of that cistern. That's not supposed to be. That's always supposed to be covered. And I looked down in there, and I could see the reflection of the sky on the water, and the water was moving. So I just knew that Margie had fallen down in there. So I didn't stop to think about where I was going to go, and I jumped down in there to grab Margie. Well, I get down in that cistern, and the water's up just about up to my head, but Margie isn't in there. But I am. There's no way for me to get out. So I panicked for a little bit, and then realized that panicking wasn't going to get me out. So I'd remembered the sound of that pipe where it went up into the house, and Mom was in the kitchen washing clothes. So I took my jackknife out of my pocket and started hammering on that pipe, and my mother heard it come out to look, and of course she's dropped me a ladder down in there to get me out of the well. It was about this time that Dad made a trip to Montana to buy a bunch of broncos, and I had went with him. We went out in Montana and rounded up 2 loads of horses out there, and we brung them back, and Dad would break these horses and sell them. Among those horses was one gray mare. We named her Polly. And we were breaking them horses in the spring, and I'd gone out in the field, and we had what they call buck chain hitches, where you could drive a whole bunch of horses with 2 lines. And Dad did hitch the horses up, and I had 2 broke horses on the outsides, but in the middle I had 6 of these Broncos. So I'm out there in the field with this big old 7-section Boss Harrow, and the train went down the tracks. The old Rock Island Railroad run through the farm there. And when them horses heard that train, they took off and tried to run. Well, I could hold them back, the 2 side ones, and the rest of them aren't supposed to be able to run unless one of them will take the bit in their teeth and pull that load with her bit. Well, one of them was doing that. That's Gray Mare. And they strung me out all over. Well, my dad came out, helped me round up the horses. Didn't hardly believe that I hadn't just got off and let them go, and hits the team all back up, got everything straightened around, got me back out there. The train come along and they run off again. And again I had told my dad it was that gray one. Well, Dad then took that Gray Mare and 2 other ones with her and hitched them on a sulky plow. And he went out along the railroad track to wait for to be plowing in that hard sod when that train came by. Well, he plowed there until the train came by, and guess what happened? They strung him out. They upset the plow and broke everything all to pieces. Them horses going on a dead run with that plow throwing sod up higher than the railroad tracks. So then Dad put a W on that mare and straightened everything out and got back down there again, and he got her well broke. As long as we had that horse, whenever she'd hear a train coming, she'd lay down because Dad would pull that W and throw her. He did that time and again till she got well broke on that. She'd lay down and shake until the train went by. No matter where you were thereafter, she would lay down when the train went by. I guess this was about that same year when I had decided to go to high school. Anyhow, I'd started the high school in Adrian. I'm 13 years old now. And we were sitting there milking cows one night. We milked quite a bunch of cows. Used the old kerosene lantern in the barn. And one of the cows had a calf, and Dad told me to go put one of them calves, go put that calf in the calf pen down at the end of the barn. So I did that. And went back to milking my cow, and pretty soon Dad come along and booted the stool right out from under me and grabbed me by the back, and he said, "I told you to put that calf in the pen." Well, I said I did put her in there. Well, here was a calf back there sucking the cow again, so I takes the calf and put him down in the calf pen and went back to milking, and pretty soon I gets really booting the seat of the pants. And here was that calf back there by that cow again. So, well, I thought I better correct that situation. So I took the calf and put him down in the pen, then went and got the lantern to find the hole where the calf was getting out. And I find out that the cow had triplets. The calf wasn't getting out. I was putting a different one in there every time. I guess it was about, it was in the fall of 1927. I got expelled from school because I'd saw the school professor peeking in the girls' dressing room, and I confronted him with this when he had called me to task because he thought I wasn't doing my work right. And I said, well, at least I wasn't peeking in the girls' dressing room. He came at me with such a look in his eye that he scared me, so the only thing I could think of to do was to smack him, so I did. I smacked him and broke his glasses, and of course I got kicked out of school. And that was the last I'd heard of that for about 3 or 4 years afterwards, when they find out that school professor was a queer, and that he'd molested some of the boys in the class and all this, but I had already been kicked out of school, and I got in a big row in the fall of '27, late in the fall, after I'd been kicked out of school, and got in a fight with my brother. It wasn't a very pretty scene. We had a family row. My dad had finally said, well, if there ain't room for two of you guys here, one of you had better leave. I suppose he had in mind was my older brother, who was 19, but the older brother wasn't leaving, so I decided that I guess that'd have to be my job. So I had $45 in cash and a pony. I saddled up my pony and I took off with the intention of going down to Louisiana to see my Uncle Ed down there, which actually was my dad's uncle. It was my great uncle. We had a rice plantation down in Louisiana, and I had heard a great deal about him, so I thought that would be a good place to go. So I saddled up my pony and I headed down for Louisiana. The first part of that trip is kind of hazy in my mind now. I suppose I was in sort of a daze. But I traveled south, sticking mostly to the back roads and dirt roads, stay off any gravel. And I was still a boy. I hadn't learned how to handle money, and I would stay at hotels and eat in restaurants and buy a little corn from a pony, and I was spending my money faster than it was coming in, of course, and somewhat like the government's been doing ever since. We got down into, I think I was somewhere in Missouri or in Arkansas, and the weather was quite warm for that time of the year, and my pony had been getting a little slower the last day or so. Once in a while I'd get off and walk and lead him, and I'd led him across a wooden bridge, one of the back roads down there in one of them southern states. So I'd led him down by a creek after we'd crossed this wooden bridge to give him a drink of water and let him rest a little bit. The pony had taken a drink of water, and I'd got him back up on the creek bank and was peeling off his saddle, and the pony heaved a big sigh and lay down and died. Well, I guess I grew up in about a matter of an hour or so. I was homesick, and I was lost, and I was almost broke. My pony had died, my last connection with all the civilized world. So, at a loss of really what I was going to do next, I took the saddle and I stashed that up underneath that wooden bridge, the saddle and the bridle off my pony. I suppose it stayed there because I never went back to find it. I wouldn't know where anyhow. I don't even know what state I was in. And I started walking. And I walked a few miles. I came to a small town, and the mainline railroad track was going through there. But when I got into this town, there was a local, a freight train that was doing some switching there in the town, so I got into one of the wooden boxcars, and this train was going south, so I rode that for probably half of that day, just about out of money and getting hungry. So this train finally stopped at what appeared to be a big terminal. I didn't see the town, but I must have been near some pretty large town. And I got off of this local freight and listened to some of the other hobos around there talking, and they talking about the Rattler, which was a line of empty oil tankers, which was going back south down to the Texas oil fields. So I got aboard one of those tank cars, not paying too much attention to how close I was to the engine. And this long line of Rattlers took off, and that train traveled. She probably traveled 80 or 90 miles an hour. And they also take on water on the fly. They drop a little scoop into a trough alongside the tracks, and the speed of the engine just drives that water up that chute and up into the tender. But all the water don't make the bend up there at the gooseneck. Some of it comes flying back over the train, and I discovered that. Pretty soon I was not only hungry and tired, but I was wet and cold too. And that train traveled and traveled, and I just thought it would never stop. And sometime in the night, the train slowed down, and I guess we must have been down there someplace in Texas by that time. And the train slowed down and finally stopped, and I jumped off. And up in the distance, I could see some lights, and so I'd started walking in that direction. And after a while, I got to a place. I suppose it was a little restaurant and a place where the train crews and such could have a meal. And there was also some beds there. You could get a flop for a quarter. Well, a bowl of soup was 10 cents and a flop was a quarter, but I only had a quarter, so I didn't know what to do with which. I know I needed both, but I guess I had a hunch or something or other. Maybe the good Lord was looking out for me, but there was a row of slot machines there, and not having enough for the flop and for the soup both, I elected to put my quarter in that slot machine. So I put the quarter in there and pulled the handle and covered the glass with my hands. Maybe I was praying, I don't know, but the wheel stopped going around and that machine started to clatter and the quarters started coming out of it, and I counted them out, and I had over $40. I'd hit the jackpot on that slot machine. But from the time that I had spent the last of my money until that particular time, I guess I did a lot of growing up. I formed a philosophy about money then that stayed with me all my life. Told go get down to that last quarter. Always keep a little bit in reserve. So I got well fed and got my clothes dried and got rested. And then I took off hitchhiking and riding to Louisiana, which I had to go east now, southeast to get to Jennings, Louisiana. But in due time, I made it down to my Uncle Ed's plantation, and they appeared glad to see me. I don't know if they knew I was coming, but we'd made it down there, and Uncle Ed had oil pull Rumley tractors. There's a picture among our box of pictures where I'm standing up on one of the drive wheels of that tractor. The caption on that picture says that that's Guy Havener. Actually, that wasn't. That was me standing up there, and that was taken later in that after I got there when my grandmother had came down to visit her brother Ed Havener, and she's sitting on that tractor, and I'm standing up on the drive wheel. That picture is in our picture box there. But rice harvesting or rice planting was quite an interesting science. They had what we'd call lister plows. It was a V-shaped plow, and it would plow a furrow with a ridge on both sides of it. And you do this to the field. You list them all or make the ridges, and then you go with a rice planter and you plant the rice up in the tops of these ridges. And I had just finished doing the planting, and I didn't do it all. My Uncle Ed, of course, and Guy and some other men that he had working there was out there. The planting was done with horses. But then they'd taken this tractor with a lister plow onto a field that evidently hadn't been busted before. The plow wasn't working very good, and it was up in this higher land, and I was wondering why Ed had sent me out there. But later in the day, I found out why. I was sitting on this tractor and trying to make the thing work right, and not doing a very good job of middle busting or ridging. And first thing I know, I could hear water, and I looked up here, and I'm practically in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean or the Gulf of Mexico. The water had moved up there and completely surrounded me, and I was sitting on this little higher piece of land, and the water came up and completely inundated that. Well, I felt somewhat like Noah must have felt when the water was coming in. I didn't know how high this stuff was going to get. Sort of panicked, and I stopped the engine, and I was standing up on the wheel. But after an hour or so, the water receded, went back. But now all these little ridges these little furrows that we dug were all full of water. And that rice came up in there, and it grew like crazy. And it was quite an interesting way that they'd flood their land with fresh water from the Mississippi Delta. And I guess this happens twice a year when a flood tide comes back up in there and pushes this water miles inland on that flat land. None of this land was more than just a few feet above sea level. But that's the way we planted rice. And I stayed there with Ed until we harvested that rice, which was the latter part of April or early part of May, I'm not sure. But we'd finished the rice harvest, and I decided now it was time for me to move on. So I had to travel in a westerly and northerly direction to get into the wheat harvest, which was over in Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas. But I moved on up till I was in someplace in southern Kansas, and I see all the shocks of wheat for miles standing all over the country. So I stopped at a place where they had a gas engine and applied for a job as a bindle stiff. That's the guy that pitches these bundles into a hay rack, and you haul them up to the thrash rig wherever they set it, and then you pitch the bundles into the thrash rig and they thrash it and haul the wheat away. But this job is known as a bindle stiff. That's also the guy that does the shocking and such. But I was there, worked 1 or 2 days. I don't remember whether the first or second day, but the engine that they were using was a Minneapolis engine. I was practically born on one of the Minneapolis engines. My dad had bought one when I was a young boy, and I was very interested in that tractor, and I read the book that came with it from front to back, and I knew that engine like the back of my hand. I knew every bolt and moving part in it. My dad soon found out that whenever the engine wasn't running right, the thing to do was come get me, even though I was just a young boy, because I seemed to have a working knowledge of that engine, and the engine and I got along pretty good. So this paid off well. Now down in this job I was out in the field loading up a load of bundles, and I heard the engine stop, and I finished loading my load of bundles, and I'd hear the engine fire a few rounds and then die out again. So while I was out there in the field, I knew what was the matter with that engine without going up there to look at it. But all the engineers at that time, all they knew was steam engines. But this was right in the time of the transition from the big steam engine on the thrash rigs over to internal combustion engines. And very few of these engineers knew much about an internal combustion engine. So I hauled my load of bundles back up to the thrash rig, and when I got up there, I got off my hay rack and left my team stand and went over there and took a look at the engine, and I could see that there there's a little glass supply tank that the fuel pump pumps gas up into this glass tank, which is higher than the carburetor. Then the fuel line from that glass tank runs down to the carburetor, and it's a gravity feed. And then there's an overflow pipe up in the top of it, so the fuel pump is supposed to pump gas faster than the engine uses it, and the excess runs back down that overflow pipe back into the big tank. But that tank was empty, so the only gas they was using was what they'd squirt into the prime cocks. Now, they didn't know anything about putting a choke on an engine at that time, so you'd take an oil can full of gas and squirt some gas in the prime cocks, close the prime cocks, and then crank the engine. Well, that's all it was firing was the gas that they were squirting into those prime cocks. So, of course, I tell everybody in general that I'm a pretty smart boy. I knew how to make that engine run, but, well, then the boss says, if you know how to make that engine run, why don't you do it? And I said, well, I'm a bindle stiff. I'm getting $5 a day. The engineer gets more. I don't see why I should make the engine run. So it was hot. People were sweating and tempers were getting short. And nobody seemed to have any idea of what to do. And finally the guy that owned the rig said, well, if you're so damn smart, he said, if you can start that engine in 5 minutes, he said, you are the engineer. You can have that job. So I said, well, that's fine. Why didn't you say that in the first place? So I went up there and takes the plunger out of that oil pump and out of that fuel pump and dips it in some steam cylinder oil, which happens to these pumps, and they'll lose their prime. They get too dry. So I put that oil on there. Then you pump it up and down by hand, and you can pump that little jar up there full of gas. So I run that fuel pump long enough to fill the jar up with gas, and then hook the plunger back up to it, the push rod that activates the pump, and then we primed it, and I had lots of volunteers to pull the handle. Then the boss and the guy that owned the land and everybody was anxious to get going, everybody but the bindle stiffs. So we cranked the engine, and it took off and run. Now the owner, he was hedging a little bit, you know. He said, well, I probably wouldn't know how to line that engine up, because in the meantime the wind had changed, and we had to realign the thrash rig so that the blower was blowing straw downwind instead of crosswind or upwind. So well, I said, hey, you said that I was going to be the engineer. So he got a little pressure and a little ribbing from the other people around there. And well, he said, okay, if you can line that engine up in the belt, you are the engineer. So I'd done that many times. So it didn't take very long, and I had the thing lined up. And then, so from that day forth, I was an engineer. Little difference in pay. The bindle stiff paid $5 a day, and the engineer paid $15. So from that day forth, I was an engineer, and I stayed there at that job until we thrashed all the grain in that area, and then you put the thrash rig away for another year, and then you move on. You go up north, you go further north. So we finished thrashing there in southern Kansas, and I went on up into Nebraska, and now I had a letter that I took with me, and I wasn't difficult at all to get a job as a gas engineer, but I looked for these Minneapolis engines because that was my favorite. I liked them better than the Rumley or the Avery or the Altman Taylors or some of the other brands, big one-cylinder case. So I would look for people with Minneapolis engines, and I was establishing a line of jobs behind me now so that I could do this every year. And I got me a job in Nebraska. But one of the interesting things, I guess, that happened there, probably should include in this little story is I had a habit of taking a barrel and hanging it up someplace in a tree or on a shed or whatever near the place where I was usually sleeping in the barn. And I'd fill this up with water, and the sun through the day would get that water pretty warm. Then I'd get some boards to use as to walk on, so you're not walking in the mud. And then after the thrashing of the day, I would take myself a shower bath. This one particular place, I had my shower rigged up, and this guy had a bunch of daughters.